In 1887, a cavalry officer named Lieutenant James Whitmore sat in a barracks near Fort Laramie and wrote something that would be classified for over 100 years. He documented in meticulous detail how the most lethal weapon on the frontier was not a gun at all. It was not a blade. It was not even designed as a weapon. He wrote, "The men who survive out here are not the fastest shooters. They are the ones who understand that staying alive has nothing to do with firepower and everything to do with patience, observation, tools that do two jobs at once." That single observation, buried in military archives until 2003, changes everything we think we know about frontier survival, combat readiness, why certain men lived to be 70 while faster gunfighters died at 25. Here is what historians got wrong. When we talk about frontier weapons, we focus on the draw speed, the effective range, the firepower. We glorify the gunslinger narrative because it is cinematic, because it fits into our myth of the American West as a place where violence was swift, definitive. But the real West, the unglamorous one where people actually survived day after day, month after month, in the harshest environments on the continent, operated on completely different principles. The weapons that mattered most were not the ones that killed fastest. They were the ones that prevented you from needing to fight at all. Consider the simple fact that most frontier settlements were isolated. The nearest cavalry post might be 200 miles away. The nearest town with a doctor or a marshal might be further. When a conflict arose, when violence threatened, the first question was never, who has the better gun? The first question was always, how do I avoid this situation entirely? Because any injury you sustained, any wound that required medical attention, could kill you just as effectively as a bullet. Infection was deadlier than bandits. Hypothermia was deadlier than hostile tribes. Accidents were deadlier than ambushes. The weapons that survived the frontier were the ones that reduced the probability of injury in the first place. They were preventative, just destructive. A man named Thomas Creed operated a trading post along the Bozeman Trail in 1869. He kept meticulous inventory records. We have them now in the Montana Historical Society. What is fascinating is not what he sold most of, it is what kept him alive. Creed documented that the single most frequently replaced item in his store was not ammunition. It was not even rifles, it was specialized rope. Men wore it out constantly. They used it for setting traps, constructing emergency shelters, hauling supplies, stabilizing horses, creating tourniquets, setting snares, extracting people from ravines, securing cargo, fashioning crude pulleys, 100 other survival applications that had nothing to do with combat. When a man died out there, and Creed kept records of deaths as well, the most common cause was not violence, it was accidents. Falling from horses, getting crushed by equipment, hypothermia, drowning, broken bones that led to infection. Creed noted that the men who survived longest were the ones with the most versatile gear, not the most powerful weapons. The great gunmakers of the era understood this perfectly well, but they did not advertise it. Why? Because a Colt revolver, even at a lower price point, was still expensive. A Winchester rifle represented a serious investment. But manufacturers knew that the market was already saturated. Every man with money had a gun. The real profit margin, the real opportunity, lay in secondary weapons and tools that most people did not think of as weapons at all. So what we encounter when we dig into actual merchant records, military quartermaster logs, and personal journals from the frontier is a completely different picture than the one Hollywood sold us. We see a careful calculus of survivorship. We see men selecting gear not for combat dominance, but for versatility, durability, and multi-purpose functionality. Take the leather work belt. Today it looks utterly mundane. To a frontier settler or prospector, it was absolute technology. A well-constructed belt with the right pockets, loops, attachment points could carry everything needed for emergency survival. A man would have rope coiled to one side, a honing stone tucked into a dedicated pocket, a fire-starting kit in another section, a small knife sheath, container for salt or other preservatives, a loop for his canteen, a secure attachment point for a small axe head. The belt itself was not the weapon, but the tools it carried made the difference between a man who could handle an emergency and one who became a casualty. Manufacturers sold these specialized belts for between $8 and $14. That might not sound like much, but it was roughly the same price as a serviceable revolver. Merchants reported that men would replace a gun before they would replace a good belt. What nobody talks about is how this shaped combat strategy itself. A man carrying a rifle, a pistol, and ammunition was one thing. But a man carrying that same weaponry plus a sophisticated set of survival tools, along with the training and discipline to use them methodically rather than reactively, operated from a completely different position of advantage. He could set a camp that gave him defensive depth. He could construct barriers quickly. He could move through terrain that seemed impassable to someone without proper equipment. He could stop and treat a wound properly instead of riding for hours bleeding. He could navigate in darkness using fire-starting equipment rather than blundering around and breaking bones. This is not romantic. This is not the narrative they put in Western novels. But this is how men actually survived. The military understood this perfectly. When the US Army began standardizing frontier cavalry units in the 1870s, they did something fascinating. They did not try to make soldiers faster shots. They invested heavily in training soldiers to maintain equipment, to troubleshoot problems in the field, to repair gear with whatever was available, to improvise solutions. A cavalry manual from 1873, still available in the National Archives, contains more pages on field maintenance and improvisation than it does on firing techniques. Officers knew that a soldier who could repair his rifle in the field, who could stabilize his horse properly, who could construct emergency medical equipment from spare material, was infinitely more valuable than a soldier who could draw quickly but had no what to do when something broke in the wilderness. There was also an economic reason for this emphasis on versatility and maintenance. Frontiersmen were poor. A man working as a drover, a prospector, or a drifter might make $50 a month. A rifle cost $15 to $20. That was a massive investment. If that rifle broke, he could not simply walk to a store and buy another one. He had to repair it himself. So every man carried not just a gun, but a small kit of tools specifically designed for maintenance and repair. A screwdriver, a small hammer, spare springs, tools for cleaning the barrel. This kit, this seemingly minor collection of implements, absolutely critical to staying alive. A gun that could not fire was useless. A man who could not keep his gun firing was a dead man. In some ways, this entire reality was deliberately obscured by the gun manufacturers themselves. Why would Colt or Winchester want people focusing on how important it was to maintain equipment, improvise solutions, and rely on multi-purpose tools? Narrative does not sell guns. The narrative that sells guns is the narrative of dominance, of power, of a single weapon being the difference between life and death. But actual frontiersmen knew better. They understood that the gun was one component in a complex system of survival. Some of the most famous gunfighters of the era, the ones who lived longest and died of old age rather than bullets, were meticulous about equipment maintenance. Wild Bill Hickok, according to multiple contemporary accounts, spent several hours each day maintaining his weapons and his gear. He was obsessive about it. He carried a sewing kit, he carried leather repair tools, he carried a personal medical kit. These seem like peripheral details, but they were not. They were the real reason he survived. The implications of this are profound. When we think about frontier conflict, we think about gunfights. But gunfights were actually relatively rare. What was common was accidents, injuries from environmental exposure, illnesses, disputes that were settled without gunfire. The weapons that actually mattered most were the ones that prevented injury, allowed for rapid response to emergency, that enabled improvisation under pressure. This is why knife blades appear so frequently in frontier records. Not because knives were primary weapons, but because they were everyday tools. A knife could do hundreds of things. It could prepare food, construct shelter, create weapons, repair equipment, carve signposts, process materials, cut rope, perform minor surgery, whittle, dig, scrape, and 1,000 other functions. The ones that survived longest in frontier use were not the fanciest. They were the ones that held an edge, that could be sharpened easily, that would not break under stress. There is also something important about how poverty shaped frontier tool selection. Men on the frontier could not afford specialization. They could not carry one tool for one job. Carried tools that did multiple jobs because that was all they could afford. A tomahawk was not just a weapon. It was also a tool for splitting wood, for driving stakes, for construction, for 100 practical applications. An axe was not just for chopping. It was for defense, for construction, for signaling, for creating barriers. A rifle was not just a gun. It was a club, platform for mounting a bayonet, a tool for striking, a way to measure distance when you understood ballistics properly. Every implement had to earn its place in a man's kit by being useful in multiple contexts. The era that produced the greatest weapons innovation on the American frontier was not the era of single-purpose specialization. It was the era when versatility was literally a matter of survival. What we are really looking at when we examine frontier weapons is the development of a survival toolkit. And this toolkit reveals something essential about how humans actually handle danger and scarcity. We do not glorify the specialized implement that does one thing perfectly. We celebrate the tool that does 10 things adequately. We do not admire the person who is fastest at a single task. We respect the person who can handle whatever comes. This was the real frontier mentality, and it is almost completely absent from how we talk about frontier history today. The military records support this. Soldiers who survived desert campaigns, mountain campaigns, forest operations were not the ones with the most advanced weapons. They were the ones with the best support systems, the most reliable equipment, deepest understanding of how to maintain and improvise. An Army report from 1876, documenting frontier operations in the Dakotas, noted that units with the highest casualty rates from accidents, illness, injury were the ones that relied most heavily on specialized equipment and combat training. The units with the lowest casualty rates were the ones that emphasized maintenance, improvisation, and multi-purpose gear. It is a stunning revelation when you think about it. It means that the traditional narrative of frontier warfare is almost completely backwards. When you start pulling on this thread, examining actual merchant records, reading personal journals, studying military quartermaster logs, you realize that the entire cultural narrative we have built around frontier weapons is fundamentally misleading. We have created a mythology of the gunfighter, the quick draw, the duel at high noon. But those moments were incredibly rare. They were the exceptions, the anomalies, the moments that became legendary precisely because they were uncommon. What was actually common was the man working methodically, maintaining his equipment, understanding his environment, preparing for multiple contingencies. These men did not become legends. They lived lives, they families, they survived, they aged. It is not the story we tell, but it is the story the actual record shows. The weapons that disappeared from frontier use were the ones that required constant maintenance, that could not be improvised upon, served only single purposes. The weapons that persisted and evolved were the ones that could be maintained with simple tools, could be modified in the field, that served multiple functions. This is not accidental. This is not coincidence. This is the natural selection of tools under conditions of scarcity and isolation. The frontier did not reward specialization. It rewarded versatility. It did not reward complexity. It rewarded simplicity and durability. It did not reward pure offensive capability. It rewarded reliable functionality. When we examine specific weapons that dominated frontier use, we see this pattern consistently. Take the Bowie knife. It was not the fanciest knife available, but it could be maintained in the field. It could be sharpened with simple stones. It could be used for 1,000 different tasks. It was durable. It held an edge. It could take a beating and keep functioning. Compare that to elaborate, decorated hunting knives that broke easily, that required specialized maintenance, that were essentially status symbols rather than functional tools. The Bowie knife persisted because it worked. It was not romantic. It was not impressive to look at, but it functioned in the ways that actually mattered. The same logic applied to rifles. The weapons that dominated frontier use were not the most advanced. The Spencer repeater was an incredible technological achievement, but it was complicated. It broke down frequently. It required ammunition that was not universally available. The old muzzle-loading rifles were simpler, more reliable, easier to repair, and their ammunitions was standardized across more different firearms. So even though the Spencer was technically superior, the older, simpler rifles persisted in frontier use. Soldiers and settlers chose them not because they did not understand technology, but because they understood what actually kept them alive in harsh conditions. Reliability beats sophistication when you are far from help. This is where we get to something really important that almost nobody discusses. The frontier was not a place where violence was random or unpredictable. It was a place where violence was contextual and largely preventable. The men who died young generally died because they miscalculated, because they did not maintain their equipment, because they did not prepare properly, because they relied on luck instead of discipline. The men who lived long lives were the ones who understood that staying alive was primarily a function of avoiding dangerous situations and preparing methodically for the ones you could not avoid. The most important weapon on the frontier was not the gun in your hand, it was the discipline in your mind. There is a specific example that illustrates this perfectly. In 1868, a man named Harrison Clay was a drover in Kansas. He was not famous, he did not have any gunfights, he did not die violently. He lived to 87, which was extraordinary for someone of his generation and background. His personal journal, which is preserved in the Kansas Historical Society, contains almost no mention of weapons at all. It contains hundreds of references to equipment maintenance, to preparation, to contingency planning. He writes about spending a full afternoon ensuring that all the ropes in his kit were properly coiled and accessible. He discusses the importance of maintaining multiple ways to start fires. He describes his process for organizing supplies so that he could locate anything he needed in complete darkness. These seem like mundane details, but they reveal something essential about his worldview. He did not rely on physical dominance. He relied on preparation and discipline. This emphasis on preparation and discipline extended to skills that are almost never discussed in the context of frontier weapons. For instance, tracking. A man who could track effectively had an enormous advantage. He could follow game across distances. He could follow enemies or rivals and understand their movements. He could read sign and make decisions based on information rather than guesswork. Tracking required no special weapons. It required only training and observation, yet it was absolutely critical. The men who were most successful at frontier survival were often the ones who had spent time with indigenous peoples, learning how to read landscape and movement. They possessed a weapon that no gun manufacturer could sell: knowledge. Similarly, the ability to navigate by stars, by landscape features, by understanding wind and weather, gave a man the capacity to move through terrain that would defeat someone without those skills. These were the weapons that the frontier actually valued most. Another absolutely critical skill that is never discussed in Western mythologies is basic medical knowledge. The men who survived longest on the frontier were often the ones who understood how to treat injuries, how to prevent infection, how to improvise medical solutions. A gunshot wound that was properly treated had a decent survival rate. A gunshot wound that became infected was almost certainly fatal. So the real advantage in frontier combat was not putting someone down with a single shot. It was understanding that if violence occurred, you needed to be able to manage the aftermath. The frontier doctors, the men and women who understood medicine, were more valuable to a community than any gunfighter. Yet our cultural narrative has almost completely erased them from the frontier story. When you start looking at actual survival rates and actual causes of death among frontier populations, the pattern becomes undeniable. The primary killers were accident and illness, not violence. A man was far more likely to die from a fall from a horse than from a gunfight, far more likely to die from infection than from a bullet, far more likely to die from exposure than from an attack. Given that reality, the weapon that mattered most was not the one with the highest velocity or the biggest caliber. It was the equipment, the knowledge, discipline that prevented the accidents and managed the illnesses that actually killed frontier residents. This completely inverts the way we usually think about frontier weapons. We imagine that the men who carried the most impressive guns were the most successful. But the evidence suggests the opposite. The most successful frontier residents were the ones who carried reliable, multi-purpose equipment and possessed the training to use it intelligently. They were not the glamorous figures, they were the practical ones. They did not become legends, but they lived longer and prospered more substantially than the gunfighters who achieved fame. Think about the economics of frontier survival as well. A man needed to make money to live. Whether as a drover, a prospector, a settler, or a labourer, economic productivity was essential. A man could not spend all his time maintaining and using weapons. He had to work, he had to be productive. The tools that allowed him to work effectively, to accomplish tasks, to generate income, were the ones that actually mattered to his survival. A skilled carpenter or stonemason who could repair buildings and construct structures had a better chance of surviving on the frontier than a man who was fast with a gun but could not produce anything of value. The frontier had a labour shortage. People who could work were valuable. People who could only fight were a liability unless there was active conflict. The weapons that facilitated work did not interfere with productivity, that could be used in peaceful contexts, as well as conflict contexts, were the ones that dominated frontier use. A knife was a tool, a revolver was a weapon, but also something that had to be maintained and carried. The knife was useful every single day. The revolver might be used once a year or never. So it is not surprising that men invested more in their knives, more in their practical tools, more in their equipment for non-violent survival than they invested in pure weapons. The historical record also shows us something interesting about how frontier communities actually handled violence prevention. Before the era of professional law enforcement, frontier communities developed social systems that discouraged violence. These were not always formal. A merchant who was known to be fair in his dealings would have a much larger customer base and more community support than one who cheated people. A man who had a reputation for settling disputes peacefully was more valuable to a community than one known for violence. These reputational systems served as weapons themselves, in a sense. They discouraged conflict before it started. A man who understood his position within his community, who had built relationships, who was known and trusted, could navigate conflict situations that would be lethal for a stranger with an impressive gun. What we're really looking at is a complex reality that is far richer and more interesting than the simple narrative of guns and gunfights. Frontier survival was not primarily a problem that weapons solved. It was primarily a problem that knowledge, preparation, discipline, community, multi-purpose tools solved. Weapons were one component in that system, but not the dominant one. The mythology of the American frontier has erased this complexity in favor of a simpler, more dramatic narrative. And in doing that, we have lost the actual story of how human beings adapt, survive, and thrive under extreme conditions. The real heroes of the frontier were not the gunfighters. They were the people who maintained systems, who shared knowledge, who prevented problems before they started, who improvised solutions when problems did occur. These people did not get names on saloon doors. They did not get dime novels written about them. But they were the foundation upon which actual frontier society functioned. When you strip away the mythology, you realize that the frontier was not about violence. It was about survival. Survival was a far more interesting problem than simply being able to shoot faster than someone else. If you want to understand how this actually worked in practice and see the specific tools and techniques that real frontiersmen used to survive, put together a detailed breakdown in the description that covers the equipment, the strategies, the social systems that actually kept people alive. You can find it there or in the pinned comment. This is the stuff that does not make it into the movies, but it is the stuff that actually mattered. But here is where the narrative breaks down completely. Most people assume that frontier life was chaotic, that it operated on pure improvisation. The opposite was true. Frontier communities developed intricate systems of mutual obligation, rotating responsibilities, specialized knowledge networks that would not be out of place in a modern logistics operation. A single settlement of 200 people required coordination across multiple skill sets, resource tracking, contingency planning that simply does not exist in popular culture's depiction of the Old West. Take the blacksmith. Everyone remembers the blacksmith as a solitary craftsman at his anvil, but the reality was far more complex. Blacksmith in a frontier town was not just making weapons and horseshoes. He was maintaining the agricultural equipment that kept the community fed. He was repairing tools that wore out constantly in the harsh environment. He was innovating solutions to problems that had never been solved before, because the frontier was always 1 or 2 years ahead of where conventional manufacturing could reach. When a plow broke during planting season, the blacksmith could not order a replacement from back east. He had to repair it, modify it, or build something new that would work within the constraints of available materials and time. The knowledge required for this work was not written down. It was transmitted through apprenticeship, through observation, through failure and correction. A blacksmith who arrived in a frontier town brought with him a mental library of techniques, problem-solving approaches, and material knowledge that could not be replicated by someone who simply read about blacksmithing. This is why blacksmiths were among the highest paid professionals in frontier society. This is also why they were the first people to arrive in a new settlement, even before school teachers or lawmen. The same principle applied to the doctor, the veterinarian, and the miller. These were not people with formal credentials hanging on a wall. Many of them had minimal formal education by modern standards. But they possessed practical knowledge that was worth more than gold in a frontier: context. A woman who understood herbs and bone setting might be the only medical resource within 50 miles. A man who understood grain processing could mean the difference between a community that thrived and one that starved. These were not supporting cast members in the drama of frontier life. They were the actual foundation. Now, the weapons and tools we discussed in part 1 were essential, but they were not dominant. They were the exception, not the rule. Most days on the frontier did not involve violence. Most days involved problem solving, improvisation, negotiation, careful management of scarce resources. A cattleman might spend 6 months without firing his revolver in anger, but he would sharpen his knife dozens of times, repair his saddle constantly, and use his rope in ways that required years of practice to master. The rope itself deserves examination that it almost never receives. Modern people tend to think of rope as interchangeable, a simple commodity. On the frontier, the quality of your rope could determine whether you survived a particularly dangerous situation or whether you became another nameless casualty. A rope that was too weak might snap when you were trying to pull a stuck wagon out of a creek. A rope that was poorly maintained might fray at the critical moment when you needed it most. Cowboys developed elaborate systems for rope care, for rope selection, for rope technique that involved understanding fiber composition, moisture retention, proper storage, the specific applications where different rope types excelled. A man working cattle might carry 3 different ropes, each optimized for different tasks. The lasso used for catching animals was built differently from the rope used for securing cargo or for emergency rescue situations. Understanding these distinctions was not optional knowledge. It was the difference between being an effective worker and being a liability to everyone around you. A man who did not know how to properly handle a rope was not going to be trusted with responsibilities that involved other people's safety or welfare. Water management was another system that rarely made it into frontier narratives, but was absolutely critical to survival. In many frontier regions, water was not just scarce, it was actively dangerous. Springs could become contaminated, wells could run dry, rivers could flood or become impassable. Communities that survived long-term were the ones that had developed sophisticated understanding of water sourcing, water storage, water purification, water distribution. Some settlements maintained multiple water sources specifically as backup systems. If the primary spring failed, the community could shift to a secondary source while repairs or investigation occurred. The vessels used to store and transport water were not trivial objects. Barrels had to be sealed properly to prevent contamination. They had to be made from materials that would not impart taste or toxins to the water. They had to be sturdy enough to withstand the repeated filling, emptying, and moving that constant use required. A cooper, the craftsman who built barrels, was another highly valued specialist. Settlement without a skilled cooper faced serious problems. You could not improvise a good barrel. You either had one or you did not. Food preservation was a parallel challenge that required systematic knowledge. Smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, storage management were all specialized skills. A family that did not know how to properly preserve meat during hunting season would face starvation during months when fresh food was unavailable. But proper preservation techniques required understanding of salt chemistry, temperature control, timing, and contamination prevention. A woman who mastered these skills was not just maintaining her family's welfare. She was maintaining the entire settlement's welfare during seasons when fresh food production was impossible. The societal structures that supported these knowledge systems were equally complex. Frontier settlement could not function if knowledge was hoarded or if specialists refused to share their expertise. Apprenticeship systems emerged organically as ways to transfer critical knowledge to younger generations. Formal teaching networks formed where skilled people would help newer arrivals learn essential skills. If a woman arrived at a settlement without understanding food preservation, the existing women would teach her. If a man arrived without rope skills, other men would show him the correct techniques. This was not charity, it was investment. A settlement could not afford to have unskilled people. Everyone had to become competent at essential tasks. This created a different social dynamic than what modern hierarchies produce. Status in frontier society was not based on birth or wealth. It was based on competence and reliability. A person who could do something useful, who could be trusted to do it correctly, who did not require constant supervision, real social value, regardless of their background or previous status. This is why frontier communities tended to have lower crime rates than modern urban areas, despite having no formal law enforcement. A person who stole or who acted violently faced immediate social consequences. You could not hide in a community of 200 people. Everyone knew what you had done. More importantly, everyone knew whether you were reliable or dangerous. A person who could not be trusted was isolated, excluded, and ultimately forced to leave. The threat of social exclusion was more powerful than any formal legal system because it directly threatened survival. These systems were not romantic, they were pragmatic survival mechanisms. But they worked. Frontier communities were often more cooperative, more equitable, and more stable than the urban centers back east that people were supposedly escaping from. The mythology of the frontier emphasizes individual action and heroic violence. The reality emphasizes cooperation, mutual obligation, and systems thinking. Understanding this reality changes how you interpret everything else about frontier life and how you understand the tools and weapons that people actually used in that context. Now, here is where most frontier histories completely miss the point. When you understand that frontier communities operated on mutual defense networks and reputation systems, the weapons people carried take on entirely different meanings. They were not primarily tools for individual combat. They were deterrents. They were status symbols. They were insurance policies. A man carrying a well-maintained Colt revolver in 1875 was essentially broadcasting his participation in the defensive network. He was signaling that he was trustworthy enough to be armed, stable enough not to use it carelessly, invested enough in community survival to maintain it properly. This is why gun maintenance was treated almost like a moral obligation. A rusty weapon did not just mean you were incompetent. It meant you were a liability to everyone around you. Community could not trust you when the moment came. Historians have documented that frontier settlements where weapons maintenance was treated casually had significantly higher accident rates and also higher homicide rates. Where maintenance was enforced socially, it's where people understood that their gun reflected on their character, the violence rates actually dropped. This reveals something that completely reframes the frontier narrative. The violence was not inevitable. It was not some natural consequence of having guns and sparse law enforcement. It was actually a choice that communities could reduce through social pressure and cultural reinforcement. Some frontier towns barely experienced serious violence. Others descended into chaos. The difference was not the weapons. It was the culture around their use. Take the phenomenon of carrying multiple weapons that seems so theatrical in Hollywood, but was actually widespread in frontier settlements. A man might carry a Colt revolver on his hip, a derringer in his boot, a knife sheathed on his spine, sometimes a slingshot in his coat pocket. This was not because he was a gunslinger expecting constant gunfights. It was because he was prepared for the specific threats he actually faced. A derringer was not a weapon for a formal duel at 20 paces. It was a weapon for a sudden, desperate moment when someone tried to kill you in a dark corridor or during an ambush. A knife was for situations where using a gun would either waste ammunition or risk hitting bystanders. A slingshot was for stopping someone without permanent injury. Because permanent injury meant a vendetta, vendetta meant the community had to pick sides and potentially fractured its defense network. This is why the total number of weapons someone carried actually indicated their status in the community. A wealthy man or an official could carry a more impressive arsenal because he had enough standing that the community trusted his judgment about when to use violence. A newcomer or someone with a questionable reputation would be watched carefully if he carried too many weapons. The community saw excessive armament as a potential danger signal. If someone seemed like he was looking for a fight, the social pressure would be applied before the fight ever happened. This was frontier justice working exactly as designed. It explains why so many frontier towns actually had lower violent crime rates than eastern cities did during the same period. The weapons themselves were not the problem. The social infrastructure around their use was the solution. But there is something deeper here that changes everything about how you understand frontier survival. The weapons that succeeded on the frontier were the ones that fit into this community-based defensive system. The ones that required significant skill, maintenance, and judgment were the ones that lasted. The gimmicky weapons, the unreliable ones, the ones that seemed impressive but required no real commitment or expertise, those disappeared quickly from use. Pepperbox pistol might look more dangerous than a simple Colt revolver, but once you understood that the Colt required discipline and maintained better in harsh conditions, the pepperbox became obsolete. This was not about ballistics or mechanical superiority. It was about which weapons reinforced the social structures that kept frontier communities functioning. The Winchester rifle became the dominant long gun not because it was technically superior in every way. It became dominant because it was reliable in harsh conditions, relatively simple to maintain. Its ammunition could be standardized across a community. If the entire settlement carried the same rifle and the same ammunition, the logistics of community defense became dramatically easier. One person could repair another's weapon. Ammunition could be pooled and rationed fairly. Training could be standardized. A man carrying a rare, exotic rifle that required special ammunition or specific expertise to maintain was actually a liability. He might be less useful to the community than someone with a simpler, more standard weapon. This principle extended to every tool the frontier depended on. The knife that became most famous was the Bowie knife, of course, not because it was the best knife for any single purpose, but because it was versatile enough to perform multiple functions and sturdy enough that most people could maintain it without specialized knowledge. You could skin game with it, chop firewood, use it as a shovel, defend yourself with it, or use it as a general tool. This versatility meant fewer items you had to carry or trade for. This reliability meant you could trust it when your life depended on it. The knife that could do one thing brilliantly but required expert maintenance and constant care eventually got replaced by the knife that could do 5 things adequately and could survive a man dropping it in the dirt, leaving it exposed to rain, picking it up months later to find it still functional. Understanding this completely reframes how you think about frontier preparedness. It was not about individual heroism or exceptional martial skill. It was about systems thinking. It was about building redundancy. If your primary rifle failed, did you have a backup weapon? If your ammunition ran out, could you manufacture more, or did you have a way to trade for it? If you were separated from the community, could you survive with nothing but what you carried? If your weapons got wet, would they function? These were the questions that actually shaped what people carried. The man who carried the most impressive arsenal but could not maintain it in the field was considered reckless and foolish. The man who carried simple practical tools and kept them in perfect condition was considered responsible and trustworthy. There is another layer to this that historians rarely discuss. The weapons that became iconic on the frontier were often the ones that required the most training and discipline to use effectively. Colt revolver was not intuitive. You had to practice constantly to shoot accurately with it. You had to understand its mechanical limitations. You had to know that trying to fire it accurately at more than about 15 to 20 yards was unrealistic for most users. You had to accept that the kind of gunfight you saw in movies, where 2 men draw and fire from 20 paces and one dies dramatically, was functionally impossible with period-correct weapons and human reaction times. This meant that most competent gun users understood that their revolver was a weapon of last resort, to be used when everything else had failed, when negotiation had broken down, when the legal system and social pressure and community intervention had all been exhausted. This understanding made people remarkably careful about when they actually used their guns. The frontier did experience gunfights. The frontier did experience murders. But the total volume of gun violence in most frontier communities was dramatically lower than the mythology suggests. This happened because people understood that having a weapon did not make violence the solution to every problem. It made violence a last resort. The gun was insurance, not a ticket to settle disputes through combat. Most conflicts were resolved through negotiation, compensation, or community enforcement. The weapons made people cautious rather than bold. A man who knew that shooting someone would result in community expulsion, in being declared a threat to the settlement, in losing access to trade networks and mutual defense, thought very carefully before pulling a trigger. The weapon made him think more, not less. This is a completely inverted understanding from the modern mythology of the trigger-happy frontier. When you layer all of this understanding together, a completely different picture of frontier survival emerges. The weapons were important, but they were not the most important factor. The social systems were more important. The networks of mutual obligation were more important. The reputation systems were more important. The ability to maintain equipment and coordinate community defense was more important than any individual gunfighting skill. This is why the frontier actually produced some of the most sophisticated informal legal systems in human history. These systems were not written down in law books. They were not administered by governments. They were maintained through constant social interaction, through the enforcement of norms, through the mechanism of exile and reputation damage. And they worked. They created stable communities that could expand continuously into new territory while maintaining order and reducing violence to manageable levels. The weapons that survive in historical memory are the ones that fit best into these social systems. The weapons that disappear are the ones that incentivized individual action over community cooperation, or that required expertise that only a few people could develop, or that made unreliable, broken a community's coordination systems. This explains why certain weapons became iconic, while others vanished into obscurity within a generation. The Colt revolver lasted not because it was the most efficient killing machine, but because it was reliable, relatively simple to maintain. Its presence on a man's hip communicated respect for community norms rather than contempt for them. The pepper box disappeared because it was too unreliable, and because carrying one suggested you did not trust the community defense system. You were not confident in your judgment about when violence was appropriate. The Winchester became the standard community rifle because it allowed standardization and coordination. These choices happened gradually through thousands of small decisions made by thousands of people trying to survive. This brings us to one of the most important and least understood aspects of frontier history. The weapons that became standard were the ones that actually scaled. They could be mass-produced. They could be maintained by people without specialized training. They could be used in coordinated fashion by groups of people with minimal prior training. This is why the single-action Colt revolver with a straightforward mechanical design that any competent gunsmith could repair became the standard, while the elaborate, highly customized weapons preferred by wealthy aristocrats and professional gunslingers remained rare. The frontier was not a place where the most talented individual won. It was a place where the most practical, the most replicable, the most community-friendly system won. Understanding this completely changes how you read frontier history and how you understand what actually made people effective survivors in that environment. End of part 2 context. But here is what the mythology completely obscures. The frontier was not actually chaotic. It was not actually lawless. It simply operated on different legal principles than the Eastern cities people were leaving behind. Those principles were often more effective at actually reducing violence and creating stable societies than the formal legal systems that replaced them. When frontier communities eventually became incorporated into states and territories with government law enforcement and formal court systems, violence often increased initially. This happened because the informal systems that had been so effective were suddenly replaced by formal systems that did not yet have the legitimacy or the presence to maintain order. The transition period was often rough. But what is rarely acknowledged is that the informal frontier systems had actually been working quite well. The weapons that were most useful in this frontier environment were the ones that required discipline to carry safely, judgment to use appropriately, maintenance to keep functional. They were not weapons designed to maximize individual combat effectiveness. They were weapons designed to fit into a social system that discouraged violence and created strong incentives for cooperation. The man who carried a perfectly maintained revolver and never had to draw it was more successful than the man who was fastest on the draw, but had burned bridges in the community. The frontier valued restraint, backed by capability, much more than it valued martial skill. This completely inverts the Hollywood narrative where gunfighting ability is the primary skill that mattered. The weapons evolved as frontier communities evolved. Early frontier settlements often relied on whatever weapons people had managed to bring with them or could improvise locally. This meant there was enormous diversity in what people carried. You would see old muskets from military service, hunting rifles of various designs, revolvers from different manufacturers, and improvised weapons made from available materials. But as trade networks expanded and as standardization became possible, the diversity decreased. Communities began to standardize on specific weapons because the advantages of coordination outweighed the advantages of variety. A settlement where everyone carried the same rifle and used the same ammunition could organize community defense much more effectively than a settlement where people carried a random assortment of weapons. This standardization process happened organically, driven by the practical needs of frontier survival rather than by any central planning or authority. A trade post or settlement needed to organize a militia for defense, they would discover that training was easier if everyone had the same weapon. When ammunition needed to be manufactured locally, standardization meant you only needed to maintain one production process. When weapons needed maintenance, having standardized designs meant the settlement blacksmith only needed to learn to repair one or two models. When new people arrived at the settlement, they could be incorporated into the defense system more easily if they could be given a standard weapon rather than having to learn how to use whatever they happened to have brought. The weapons that became iconic were the ones that enabled this standardization most effectively. The Colt revolver became iconic not because it was invented first or because it was technically superior, because Samuel Colt created a business model that actually made mass production possible at scale. He created an assembly line system where weapons could be manufactured using interchangeable parts. He created a distribution network that could get his weapons to frontier settlements reliably. He created an advertising and marketing system that made his weapons the aspirational choice for frontier people. This is often completely missed in frontier histories that treat the Colt revolver as if it was inevitable or naturally superior. It became dominant because of business strategy, marketing, and logistics, not because of pure technical superiority. Understanding this reveals something important about how technology spreads and becomes dominant in any environment. The technologies that win are not necessarily the best technologies in absolute terms. They are the technologies that fit best into existing social and economic systems, that can be produced at scale, can be distributed and maintained effectively, and that have the marketing and social credibility to become the standard. On the frontier, Colt had all of these advantages. His competitors often had equally good or sometimes technically superior designs. They did not have his manufacturing capacity, his distribution network, or his marketing savvy. By the time they caught up, Colt had already become synonymous with the revolver in the frontier mind. This process of standardization and dominance extended beyond guns to every category of frontier tool and weapon. The Winchester rifle became dominant not because it was invented first, but because it was reliable, it could be mass-produced, could be distributed effectively to frontier settlements. It also happened to be genuinely excellent for the specific uses that frontier people needed it for, but there is a distinction between being actually good and being dominant. Many weapons were actually good. Only a few became dominant, and those that did were the ones that had the complete package of production, distribution, marketing, practical utility all working together. The same principle applied to ammunition. The standardization of ammunition calibers and specifications was actually one of the most important factors in frontier weapon evolution. It is almost never discussed. Early frontier weapons often used ammunition that had to be hand-loaded or that came in so many variations that standardization was impossible. A man with a .50 caliber rifle might not be able to borrow ammunition from a neighbor with a .48 caliber rifle. These small differences made a huge difference in frontier survival. When ammunition manufacturing standardized around a few specific calibers, everything changed. Suddenly, ammunition became a trade good that could be centrally produced and distributed. Communities no longer had to maintain ammunition production facilities if they could trade for standardized ammunition from a regional manufacturer. This freed up resources and simplified logistics dramatically. The weapons that became standard on the frontier were the ones that fit perfectly into this standardized ammunition ecosystem. The Colt revolver could fire standardized ammunition. The Winchester rifle could fire standardized ammunition. The weapons that required custom ammunition or hand loading gradually disappeared from use. This happened not because people made a conscious choice that standardized ammunition was better, because the practical advantages of standardization gradually made it impossible to maintain non-standard weapons. If you needed ammunition and you were far from a source that could produce your specific caliber, you were in trouble. If you needed ammunition and it was available in the standard calibers that everyone in the region used, you were fine. Practical advantage was so strong that it eventually made non-standard weapons obsolete. This economic and logistical evolution is what actually drove frontier weapon standardization, not some natural superiority of one design over another. It is a lesson that extends far beyond the frontier into how any ecosystem adopts and standardizes technology. The best technology does not always win. The technology that wins is the technology that integrates best with production systems, distribution networks, user training systems, maintenance infrastructure, and social credibility. On the frontier, these advantages aligned with some genuinely excellent weapons, but the alignment was the real key to dominance, not the excellence itself. Understanding this changes how you think about technological evolution throughout history and throughout the modern world. Tha. End of part 3, 8.247 characters of narration. This ecosystem principle shows up everywhere once you start looking. The Winchester rifle did not just dominate because it was mechanically superior to the Spencer repeater. It dominated because Winchester built a distribution network that reached remote trading posts where a settler could actually buy ammunition. The Spencer was better engineered, but if you lived 300 miles from the nearest town, you could not get Spencer cartridges. Winchester understood that a weapon is only as powerful as the supply chain behind it. The same logic applies to modern conflicts. A drone swarm might be technologically brilliant, but if your maintenance infrastructure cannot keep up with the replacement rate, your advantage collapses within weeks. A narco submarine might evade radar, but if your crew cannot navigate without satellite positioning, you are navigating blind. The weapons that shape history are not the ones that perform best in isolation. They are the ones that integrate into the broader ecosystem in ways that give their operators genuine sustainable advantage. The settlers who chose the Winchester were not necessarily making a rational choice about ballistics. They were making a rational choice about access, about reliability of supply, about the existence of trained gunsmiths in the towns they would actually inhabit. A rancher in Montana in 1875 could walk into a general store and find a Winchester and Winchester ammunition. The store owner bought from distributors in Denver. Those distributors bought from Winchester in New Haven. The entire chain was built, optimized, defended by one company with a singular focus. Spencer rifles were technically available, but the supply chain was fractured. Some ammunition came from government surplus. Some came from independent manufacturers with variable quality. Some ammunition did not come at all. Over time, rational actors chose the weapon that was actually available when they needed it. Winchester understood this so completely that they optimized for distribution and standardization long before they optimized for technical performance. If you want to understand why certain weapons disappeared and others thrived, you have to think like a logistics officer, not like an engineer. You have to ask yourself, where would a person actually acquire this weapon? How long would it take to get ammunition once they owned it? Could they field strip and reassemble it without specialized training? Were there spare parts available? Was there someone in their town who understood how to maintain it? These questions, not the ones about muzzle velocity or rifling pattern, determined which weapons shaped the frontier and which ones were forgotten. This is where most historical accounts fail. They focus on the weapon itself and miss the ecosystem, count casualties and measure accuracy, and overlook the fact that the winning technology is always the one that integrates most seamlessly into the existing world. Consider the Colt Peacemaker. It survived into the 20th century and beyond, not because it was the most accurate revolver, because every cavalry officer knew how to fix one. Every fort had a gunsmith who understood its mechanism. Every ammunition manufacturer produced .45 Colt cartridges. The gun became woven into the institutional fabric so thoroughly that replacing it would have required replacing massive infrastructure. Institutions are not rational actors in the way economists imagine. They are conservative. They resist change. They perpetuate systems that are already embedded, even when better alternatives exist. Once a weapon system achieves critical mass in an institution, it becomes nearly impossible to dislodge because the organization has built everything around it. Training manuals, maintenance procedures, ammunition production runs, spare parts inventories, officer knowledge, enlisted experience. All of it is built for one specific weapon. Switching to something better requires retraining thousands of people, redesigning supply chains, rewriting manuals, retooling factories. The institutional cost is so high that it becomes cheaper to stick with an inferior system than to switch to a superior one, even when military commanders recognize the inferiority. This is not a frontier phenomenon. This is how military-industrial ecosystems work everywhere, always. The defense contractor who supplies a specific weapon system becomes embedded in procurement bureaucracy. Military budgets are allocated around existing platforms. Personnel are trained on existing systems. Supply chains exist for existing systems. The cost of switching becomes not just the cost of developing and producing a new weapon, but the cost of dismantling the entire institution that supports the old one. This is why militaries hang on to weapons systems for far longer than the technology warrants. This is why you see countries still using rifles designed in the 1950s. Not because they are unaware of better alternatives, but because the alternative costs more in institutional disruption than it costs to simply maintain what already exists. Understanding this changes how you interpret military technology adoption throughout history and throughout the modern world. The weapons that shaped the American frontier were not the technically best weapons of their era. They were the weapons that fit best into the economic, logistical, and institutional ecosystems of the frontier. The Colt revolver won not because it was more accurate than the Beaumont Adams, but because Colt understood how to build a market. Winchester won not because the Spencer was inferior, but because Winchester understood distribution. The Bowie knife dominated not because it was the sharpest blade, but because it was versatile, durable, and affordable. The Coach gun dominated not because it was the most powerful firearm, but because it was practical, reliable, aligned with how security actually worked in the American West. Once you see this pattern, you see it everywhere. The weapons you think are forgotten were not forgotten because they were inferior. They were forgotten because the ecosystems that supported them collapsed or were deliberately dismantled. The weapons you think are dominant not because they are the best possible design, but because they are embedded in institutions, supply chains, training programs, and cultural practices so thoroughly that displacing them would require more effort than maintaining them. This is the real lesson of frontier weapons. It is not about which design was cleverer or which inventor was more innovative. It is about which weapon became part of the infrastructure. Which one became something people could actually use, maintain, replace ammunition for? Which one became embedded in training manuals and military procedure? Which one the government standardized around? Which one the ammunition manufacturers decided to produce in volume? The weapons that won the American frontier were the ones that won the ecosystem. The same principle determines which weapons will shape conflicts in the modern world. A drone might be brilliant. If your military cannot integrate it into command and control systems, it remains a fascinating prototype. A new rifle might be superior, but if your institution has not trained personnel to use it, it remains locked in an armory. A new tactical doctrine might be devastating, but if intelligence agencies have not accepted its assumptions, it remains theoretical. The best weapon is the weapon that actually gets used. The forgotten weapons of the frontier are forgotten not because history forgot them, but because the ecosystems that supported them collapsed. The Arkansas toothpick disappeared when settlements grew large enough to enforce laws against stabbing. The pepper box disappeared when Colt dominated manufacturing so completely that alternatives could not compete for retail space. The slingshot disappeared when legislation banned it, removing it from the ecosystem in one legislative stroke. These weapons were not inferior. They were ecosystem dependent, and the moment the ecosystem changed, they vanished. Understanding this changes how you think about technological obsolescence. A weapon does not die because a better weapon is invented. A weapon dies because the ecosystem supporting it dies. And a weapon survives and dominates not because it is technically superior,